Welcome to the deep dive. We are going straight to the source today, and we're strapping in for, I think, one of the most explosive and, let's be honest, often misunderstood minds in all of Western history.
We are. We're talking about the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche.
Absolutely. His work is just defined by its intensity, isn't it? It's all about these sharp, unforgettable aphorisms and an irony so deep it has, it's fundamentally reshaped how we think about morality, religion.
And the very concept of objective truth itself, it's hard to overstate his impact.
It really is. And, people hear the name Nietzsche-born Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, right? He lived from 1844 to 1900.
That's the one. And while his intellectual earthquake is still rattling the foundations of philosophy today, his career actually began in a really surprising place. He was a classical philologist.
Which is such a formal, rigid discipline.
Incredibly meticulous, a student of ancient Greek and Roman texts. He started there, in that world of precision, before he transformed into the profound cultural critic and poet that we know today.
His influence is just enormous. But as you said, his name often comes prepackaged with this caricature.
It does.
He's the philosopher of the Superman, the great destroyer of God. He's almost become this kind of intellectual villain in popular culture.
Right, sort of bogeyman for modernity.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really cut through all of that noise.
Yeah.
We need to explore the authentic, the radical core of his philosophy. We're talking about the diagnosis of the death of God, the fundamental drive he called the will to power, and of course the challenge he posed to all of humanity with the Übermensch.
And we absolutely must, right from the very beginning, confront the central tragedy and irony of his entire legacy.
The distortion.
The ultimate distortion. This was a man who was an outspoken champion of individualism and intellect, against the crushing mediocrity of mass movements. He was explicitly anti-nationalist and fiercely anti-Semitic.
He broke with publishers, with friends.
And even his own sister over these very issues. He put his career and his relationships on the line for these principles.
Yet somehow, his writings, posthumously manipulated by that very sister, became notoriously associated with fascism and Nazism.
It's just the ultimate intellectual crime. So our core mission, really, is to understand the integrity of his ideas before they were weaponized, before they were maliciously edited. We have to trace the path that took this brilliant and actually deeply religious young scholar from a pious Prussian home to becoming the ultimate challenger of European culture itself.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, right, with the roots.
Absolutely. To understand Nietzsche, you really have to start with his upbringing.
He was born in 1844 in a small town in Prussia called Rücken. And he came from this incredibly deep-rooted religious background.
Deep is the word for it. His family had a long, long line of Lutheran clergymen. His own father was the town pastor.
And he was even named after the king, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV.
That's right. So you have this boy born into the absolute heart of the Prussian establishment, pious, conservative, patriotic, everything he would later come to dismantle.
But his youth was really defined by this profound and shaping trauma.
It was. When Nietzsche was just 4 years old, his father died of what they diagnosed as a brain disease. And then just 6 months after that, his younger brother died as well.
So at the age of 5, he's already had to confront death twice in the most intimate way possible.
Exactly. And so he was raised in this heavily conservative, very matriarchal household. It was his mother, his grandmother, and 2 unmarried aunts. They moved to a town called Naumburg.
You have to imagine that early instability, that focus on death and grief, must have deeply informed his later rejection of any life-denying worldviews.
It's hard to see how it couldn't have. He saw firsthand the way piety could be a comfort, but also perhaps a way of avoiding the harshness of reality.
And he seems to have had this just prodigious intellect from a very early age. He landed a spot at Schultfurte.
Which was, and still is, one of the most elite schools in Germany, a breeding ground for the intellectual class.
And this is where he got that incredible grounding in classical languages. We're talking Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French. These were the tools of the trade for what was then called classical philology.
That's such a crucial term to define for anyone listening. Classical philology isn't just about translating old texts. It is the meticulous historical study of language, of literature from classical antiquity.
So you're analyzing manuscripts, you're dating them, establishing context. It's almost like textual forensics.
It's incredibly rigorous. And Nietzsche excelled at this historical method. But interestingly, his initial goal was still to follow in his father's footsteps. He went to the University of Bonn to study theology. He wanted to be a minister.
And that is where the crisis of faith happened. And it seems like it was swift and just total.
It was a complete intellectual implosion of his faith.
What were the specific catalysts? What books or ideas just blew up his inherited piety?
Well, there are two major influences that really stand out. First, he read David Strauss's Life of Jesus.
Which was a hugely controversial book at the time.
Monumentally so, because it treated the biblical story not as divine revelation, but as myth and legend that was subject to historical critique, just like any other ancient text. It stripped the divinity away and looked at it as a human document.
And the second influence?
Critically, it was Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach famously argued that it was humanity that created the concept of God in its own image, not the other way around.
So the divine is just a projection of our own highest ideals and desires.
Precisely. Feuerbach claimed we take all the things we value, love, wisdom, power, and we project them onto this external being, God, and then we worship our own creation. For a young man grappling with faith, that was a philosophical bombshell.
That intellectual break must have been just devastating for his family, especially for his very devout sister, Elizabeth. Remember that striking quote from a letter he sent her?
Oh, it's one of his most famous early statements. He basically laid out the ultimate intellectual choice. He wrote, "Hence the ways of men part. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and pleasure, then believe. If you wish to be a devotee of truth, then inquire."
And he was choosing inquiry.
He was choosing the pursuit of difficult, often painful truth over the comfort of faith. And that single choice right there sets the trajectory for everything that follows in his life.
Okay, so he's abandoned theology. He's now shifted fully into philology, and he follows his very influential professor, Friedrich Nietzsche, to the University of Leipzig.
Nietzsche was a giant in the field. To be his protege was a huge deal.
But Nietzsche trained philologists, not philosophers. So what were the philosophical awakenings in Leipzig that really cemented Nietzsche's new radical direction?
In 1865, he just stumbled upon a book in a secondhand shop. Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation.
And this book just completely changed him.
It floored him.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer's metaphysical pessimism, this idea that the fundamental nature of reality is a blind, ceaseless, irrational will that causes all suffering, it was incredibly powerful for young Nietzsche. It gave him a framework for understanding the world without God.
He saw Schopenhauer as an educator, a guide, right? He even dedicated an essay to him later.
He did. Schopenhauer as educator. He recognized him as one of the very few thinkers he ever truly, deeply respected, even though he would ultimately come to reject Schopenhauer's pessimism.
And the second influence, Friedrich Albert Lange's History of Materialism, seems to have provided the cultural and scientific lens he needed to move forward.
Lange was fascinating. His book was a survey of the emerging scientific materialism of the 19th century. It exposed Nietzsche to ideas like Darwinian evolution and the philosophical rebellion against traditional authority.
So it grounded his thinking in the science of his day.
It did, but it also did something else. It sparked a deep skepticism in Nietzsche about the ultimate limits of scientific explanation. He felt materialism could explain the how, but it missed the why, especially when it came to human creativity, to art, to aesthetics.
Before he could fully immerse himself in academia, though, he had that brief but incredibly painful interlude in the military.
Yes, his 1 year of voluntary service in a Prussian artillery unit in 1867.
He was apparently a very skilled horseman, but that led to a terrible accident.
A very severe riding accident in 1868. It tore 2 muscles in his left side, and it left him completely incapacitated for months. The pain was apparently excruciating.
And that accident, combined with his later service as a medical orderly during the Franco-Prussian War,
where he contracted both diphtheria and dysentery.
It left him with this constellation of persistent health problems, crippling migraines, chronic indigestion, and, critically for a scholar, near blindness.
It sounds like a perfect storm of physical distress, doesn't it? It forced the philosopher who would later champion vitality and strength to live a life that was just defined by physical weakness and constant pain.
The irony is just staggering.
It is. And despite all of this, his academic ascent was still absolutely meteoric. In 1869, at just 24 years old, on the strong endorsement of his mentor Ritschl, he landed the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel.
Before he had even officially completed his doctorate.
They just awarded him an honorary doctorate from Leipzig that same year. His brilliance was that obvious.
A remarkable achievement. But here's a detail that I think speaks volumes about his early anti-nationalist bent. Before moving to Switzerland for the job, he formally renounced his Prussian citizenship.
He did. He lived the rest of his functional life as an officially stateless person. He was profoundly skeptical of the rise of Bismarck's German Empire and the whole wave of nationalism that was sweeping through Europe at the time.
He had seen the costs of war up close.
He had seen the costs of war, and he had seen the corrosive effect of German cultural pride, this sense of superiority that he found completely baseless.
His time at Basel, however, brought him into a fascinating and incredibly intense personal orbit. The composer, Richard Wagner.
They met in 1868, and Nietzsche just admired Wagner immensely. He saw in him the potential for a new, revitalized German culture, a culture built on the spirit of Greek tragedy, not on dull, beer-hole nationalism.
And this intense, almost father-son admiration resulted in his very first published book in 1872, The Birth of Tragedy, which he dedicated to Wagner.
A book that was not just a bombshell, it was a career killer in the world of philology.
Right. If philology is this meticulous, historical analysis of texts, The Birth of Tragedy was radical speculative philosophy disguised as a classical study.
That's the key friction point. Nietzsche completely abandoned the rigorous historical and linguistic method that his colleagues expected of him. Instead, he presented this grand, speculative argument about the very essence of Greek culture, this Apollonian and Dionysian dichotomy.
And then he went a step further and suggested that modern German culture could be redeemed by following Wagner's musical dramas.
His colleagues, especially his own mentor, Ritschl, found this completely unacceptable. It wasn't philology. The most famous attack came from a young, brilliant philologist named Ulrich von Wilhelmovitz-Moellendorff.
What did he write?
He wrote a scathing critique called Philology of the Future, and it essentially declared Nietzsche unfit to teach classics. It was a brutal public takedown.
So he was isolated from his academic colleagues, and then very soon after, he was isolated from his intellectual idol, Wagner, too. What caused that final, painful break?
It was a deep philosophical and cultural disappointment. The disillusionment really culminated at the very first Bayreuth Festival in 1876.
Wagner's great artistic project.
His temple to his own art. And Nietzsche went there, and he found the spectacle and the audience to be crude, banal, and just far too focused on German national glorification.
It wasn't the high culture he had hoped for.
Not at all. He realized Wagner wasn't the savior of German culture. He was just another reflection of the very nationalism and cultural mediocrity that Nietzsche had come to despise.
That rupture seems to have been absolutely necessary for his next major shift, the move away from that romantic, pessimistic metaphysics towards a sharper, more skeptical style of writing.
It was liberating for him. With his next book, Human, All Too Human, which came out in 1878, he fully adopted the aphoristic style.
Short, intense, often contradictory insights.
Exactly. This style allowed him to distance himself from the system building of both Wagner and Schopenhauer and to begin his radical critique of moral and philosophical foundations.
By 1879, his deteriorating health finally forced him to resign his position at Basel. He was granted a pension, but the pain and the near blindness just made university life impossible.
And this marks the beginning of the most productive, yet also the most personally isolated decade of his entire life.
The decade of the independent philosopher.
He was constantly on the move, a wanderer, chasing climates that might alleviate his suffering. Sils Maria in the summers, Genoa, Nice, Turin in the winters. It was a creatively explosive period, yes, but profoundly difficult, especially given his failing eyesight.
And that failing vision led to this deep, critical dependency on his former student, Peter Gast.
Gast became his indispensable private secretary. He had to transcribe Nietzsche's almost illegible handwriting. He proofread virtually everything Nietzsche wrote. He managed his affairs.
He was the conduit for all of Nietzsche's later work.
He was. The dependency was immense, but Gast was also one of the few who remained a loyal friend, even if he sometimes criticized the density of Nietzsche's major works, like Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Then we arrive at the infamous Lou Salome triangle of 1882. This relationship seems to have simultaneously inspired him and completely crushed him.
It's one of the great what-ifs of his life. Nietzsche met Lou Andreas Salome, a brilliant young Russian intellectual, and he just instantly fell in love. He proposed marriage 3 separate times.
And she rejected him every time.
She did. She preferred an intellectual community with him and his friend Paul Ray. They called it the Winter Plan, this idea that they would live and study together as intellectual siblings.
But this academic dream just quickly dissolved into personal bitterness and recrimination, and it was exacerbated by his sister, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth was fiercely protective and deeply, deeply suspicious of Salome. She labeled her an immoral woman and was convinced she was using Nietzsche.
And she actively interfered.
She did. She wrote malicious letters to the families of both Salome and Ray, basically sabotaging the entire arrangement and destroying the trio's relationship. Nietzsche was absolutely devastated.
This failure led to what he called a genuine hatred for my sister. And it was in the midst of this profound isolation and renewed illness that he found this phenomenal creative outlet.
It's the classic literary irony, isn't it? Personal catastrophe driving an explosion of genius. The first part of his masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, was written in just 10 days while he was isolated in Rapallo, recovering from this heartbreak.
That's just unbelievable.
It speaks to the intensity of his will. And importantly, this period of independence also hardened his political views against the prevailing cultural tide. In 1886, he made a very explicit public stand. He broke with his publisher, a man named Ernst Schmeitzner.
And why did he do that?
Precisely because he was disgusted by the publisher's open involvement with anti-Semitic political opinions.
So he didn't just disagree with anti-Semitism privately. He actively severed a crucial professional relationship over it.
He condemned the entire movement, stating very clearly that it should be utterly rejected with cold contempt by every sensible mind. This profound commitment to intellectual freedom and his rejection of the herd is what makes the later manipulation of his legacy so deeply tragic.
So as Nietzsche abandoned the safety of academia for the solitude of the traveler, he began to systematically dismantle the foundations of Western culture, and he started with aesthetics. Let's turn now to his great tools of demolition, starting with that foundational concept from The Birth of Tragedy, the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
This aesthetic dichotomy, which he draws from Greek mythology, is just foundational to understanding his entire view of culture. So first you have the Apollonian impulse.
Named for Apollo, the god of light and reason.
Exactly. The Apollonian represents harmony, order, clarity, logic, and, crucially, the principle of individuation, the separation of the self from the chaotic world. It is the dreaming state, full of beautiful illusions that make life bearable, its sculpture, its form.
And the Dionysian is the exhilarating, terrifying opposite of that.
Completely. Named for Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. The Dionysian represents disorder, raw emotion, intoxication, and unity. It's the temporary dissolution of boundaries, the liberation of instinct, and the direct, primal experience of the world as a unified, suffering, joyful whole. It's music, it's dance.
And for Nietzsche, classical Athenian tragedy, the works of Aeschylus and Sophocles, was the perfect, fertile fusion of these two forces. Why was that synthesis so vital?
Because it allowed the Greeks to confront the sheer terror of existence, the meaninglessness, the inevitable suffering, without resorting to denial or escape. The Dionysian chorus provided the necessary rush of ecstatic, life-affirming energy.
While the Apollonian dialogue and plot framed that chaos with beautiful form.
Precisely. It allowed the spectator to gaze directly into what he called the abyss of human suffering, and yet still affirm life passionately and joyously.
This affirmation in the face of horror is what he connected to the wisdom of Silenus, isn't it?
Yes, that's a key point. The myth holds that King Midas captures Silenus, Dionysus' companion, and demands to know what is the best thing for mankind. And Silenus replies, "The best thing of all is never to have been born. The second best is to die soon."
A completely pessimistic, life-denying view.
The bleakest possible view. And for Nietzsche, the Greek tragic spectacle, this fusion of Apollonian form and Dionysian affirmation, was a cultural achievement that allowed them to conquer this pessimism, to transform life's inherent meaninglessness into a momentary, powerful celebration.
That Dionysian frenzy sounds crucial, almost physiological. He saw it as the real mechanism of artistic creation.
He absolutely did. He stressed that this state was not just chaos, but a physiological state that provided an increase of strength, the experience of fullness and plenitude. This frenzy is what enables the creation of art. It is the artist's power manifesting, transforming things until they mirror his power. For Nietzsche, art is rooted in aesthetic health, not in moral purpose.
So where did it all go wrong? What caused the decline, the Untergang of tragedy?
Nietzsche pointed the finger directly at two figures. the philosopher Socrates and the playwright Euripides.
Why them?
He argued that they introduced an excessive focus on rationalism, on dialectic, and on moral didacticism into the art form. This Socratic emphasis on virtue is knowledge, the idea that you can reason your way to a good life, replaced the vital irrational role of myth and instinct.
So reason killed art.
In a way, yes. It undermined that ecstatic Apollonian Dionysian balance. The undergang of tragedy was a cultural catastrophe, in his view. It substituted vibrant, risky life affirmation with a pale, intellectual, and safe moralizing.
It's striking how influential this distinction became. It really reached far beyond classical studies. It influenced anthropology, psychology, modernist art.
Oh, absolutely. The anthropologist Ruth Benedict acknowledged it as the direct stimulus for her famous work, Patterns of Culture. She used Apollonian and Dionysian as models for analyzing different cultural attitudes toward ritual and emotion.
And Carl Jung as well, with his work on archetypes.
Definitely. And even the abstract expressionist painters like Mark Rothko, who were trying to capture primal emotion through pure form, they owe a direct intellectual debt to this dichotomy that Nietzsche laid out in his very first book.
Okay, moving from the nature of art to the nature of reality itself, we hit his radical critique of certainty, perspectivism. You mentioned he attacked Kant and Descartes. What does perspectivism mean for you, the listener, who probably believes that truth is out there waiting to be discovered?
Perspectivism is the idea that objective truth, a truth that exists independent of any observer, any interest, or any frame of reference, is ultimately incoherent. He believed knowledge is always conditional. It's always relative to various fluid perspectives or interests.
So is that just a fancy way of saying all opinions are equally valid? Because that's how it's often misinterpreted?
Not at all, and that's a really important distinction to make. It's not about the equality of opinions, but about the source of knowledge claims. He argued they are always rooted in the will to power, in a specific interpretation aimed at mastery, preservation, or growth. Some perspectives are demonstrably more life-affirming, more powerful than others.
So he's not just critiquing religious dogma here. He's attacking the very foundation of Western rationalism. He dismissed Descartes' foundational statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, as a naive assumption.
He saw the cogito as an unfalsifiable belief based on naive acceptance. It just presupposes that there is an I that is separate from the act of thinking, that this I is the cause, and that causality itself is a stable concept. Nietzsche saw all of this as simply inheriting a grammatical prejudice, not discovering an objective truth.
If absolute truth is gone, then the most important human act isn't knowing, it's valuing.
Precisely. In Zarathustra, he makes this crystal clear. A table of values hangs above every great person. The act of esteeming, of creating values, is the essential creative act. It's far more crucial than the specific content of those values.
He saw the irony of modern humanity in that, didn't he? 1,000 goals have there been so far. Humanity still has no goal.
Exactly. We pursue endless, small, inherited values. Be a good person, make money, be comfortable, without ever defining a collective purpose, a grand goal for humanity to strive for.
And this philosophical shift had an immediate impact on the emerging social sciences. You can see how Max Weber, for example, couldn't have developed his methodologies without absorbing this idea.
Weber absolutely absorbed perspectivism. He argued that objectivity in fields like sociology is only possible after a perspective or a value has been established. You must first choose your framework, your area of interest, say, studying the impact of capitalism on religion, and then you can be objective within that chosen frame. The frame itself is rooted in a cultural value, not in some objective, timeless reality.
Okay, that brings us directly to perhaps his most famous analysis of value, the slave revolt in morals. This is where he explains why modern morality is so fixated on self-denial and pity.
His book on the genealogy of morality details this transformation from the ancient world's good and bad to the modern world's good and evil. The original system, he argued, was master morality.
Which he associated with the aristocratic ruling classes, think Homeric heroes, right?
Exactly. Achilles, Odysseus. What defined good in that system? Good meant qualities associated with their own lives. Strength, power, health, wealth, happiness, worldly success. It was a celebration of vitality and honest instinct.
And bad.
Bad was simply whatever was low, weak, sick, pathetic. It was an object of pity, or more often just casual disregard. The master affirms himself and his values directly without reference to anyone else.
But this aristocratic system didn't last. What was the psychological weapon that the weak, the oppressed, used to overthrow it?
Slave morality. A system born out of what he called resentment, a deep-seated, repressed resentment of the enslaved and lower castes. Because the slaves lacked the physical strength or means to overcome their masters, they launched a psychological war. They performed a value inversion.
Let's unpack resentment. It's a French word he deliberately uses, and it's often left untranslated, which suggests it's more profound than just resentment.
It is much more profound. Resentment is the psychological mechanism where a person, being fundamentally incapable of acting against a source of their injury or oppression, internalizes that hatred and frustration until it literally poisons their soul. This poison is then projected outward in a creative, vengeful act of revaluation.
So slave morality is fundamentally reactive. It doesn't create its own values, just says no to everything the master stands for.
That is the crucial insight. Everything the master values, power, wealth, aggression, pride, is relabeled as evil, as cruel, as sinful.
And conversely, their own inherent weaknesses, their inability to retaliate, their poverty, their submission, are cleverly relabeled as moral virtues.
Correct. Weakness becomes meekness. Submission becomes obedience. The inability to exact revenge becomes forgiveness and charity. It's an ingenious act of self-deception that allows the weak to overcome their own sense of inferiority without ever despising themselves.
It's a fascinating and, I have to say, a horribly cynical analysis. If meekness is praised as a moral good, the meek gain a moral superiority over the masters, not through strength, but through moral condemnation.
Exactly. And the ultimate expression of this resentment, Nietzsche argued, is Christian love, which he saw as a kind of packaged vengeance. The slave cannot punish the master in this life, so the slave creates a god who will ensure the master suffers eternally in the afterlife, while the meek, the good, are rewarded. That eternal suffering for the master is the slave's quiet psychological triumph.
But hold on. If master morality celebrates cruelty and slave morality celebrates meekness, isn't the latter at least a necessary step toward building a complex, civilized society that protects its weak? Are you saying Nietzsche genuinely wanted society to revert to some kind of barbaric aristocracy that just disregards the vulnerable?
That raises a really critical point, and it's a common misunderstanding. Nietzsche was not advocating a simple return to a barbaric Homeric world. He argued that the universalization of slave morality, this idea of a single required morality for all, was the real danger.
Why?
Because it's harmful to the flourishing of exceptional individuals, the very people who could lead humanity forward. The morality for all forces the strong, the creative, the independent, to sacrifice their natural instincts for the comfort of the mediocre herd.
And this leads directly to the problem he saw plaguing Europe: nihilism. Once that underlying metaphysical scaffolding of slave morality, that promise of the afterlife, is removed by secular thought, the whole structure just collapses, revealing the purposelessness underneath.
And that revelation of purposelessness, the belief that nothing has inherent importance, is nihilism. That's why Nietzsche called for exceptional people to follow their inner law. This universal moral code, he believed, prevents individual self-overcoming. His famous motto, which he took from the Greek poet Pindar, crystallizes this demand for radical self-creation. Become what you are.
So we've established the foundation of his critique of culture and morality. Now we arrive at the core doctrines that were meant to provide a path forward in the face of this European decay. And that path begins with his most famous and certainly most misunderstood diagnosis.
The profound crisis that he announced in his book, The Gay Science, God is Dead.
This is not a triumphant declaration of atheism, right? It's not him celebrating.
Not at all. And it's not a casual observation that people stopped going to church. It is a cultural diagnosis. It signifies the collapse of the Abrahamic God as the ultimate objective source of meaning, value, and cosmic order in the West.
And the cause of this collapse?
He argued it was caused by the very pursuit of truth that was inherent in Western thought itself. The intellectual and scientific rigor that Christianity helped foster eventually turned its tools of analysis on the scripture and dogma, ultimately undermining the very guarantor of that truth. We killed him with our own need for honesty.
So it's not the death of God, the entity, but the death of God as the metaphysical guarantor of all our values.
Exactly. Once that ultimate source is gone, we are forced to realize that all our values, our morals, our laws, our sense of purpose, are merely human creations. They're interpretations rooted in history and interest. And this realization leads directly to nihilism.
The belief that life lacks ultimate purpose and inherent importance.
Yes, and he identified a specific dangerous reaction to this void, which he called passive nihilism.
This is what he saw in Schopenhauer's philosophy.
Yes, he saw it embodied in Schopenhauer, what he sometimes mockingly called Western Buddhism. It's a philosophy that advocates separating oneself from the world, from will, from desire, in order to reduce suffering. It is a will to nothingness, an escape hatch from the painful reality of life.
What specifically about that desire to retreat from life did Nietzsche find so personally offensive?
He rejected it because he saw it as being fundamentally inconsistent. It is still a form of willing. It's a will not to will. It attempts to deny the fundamental truth that life is ceaseless striving, conflict, and overcoming. For Nietzsche, strength is defined by facing the horror of existence and saying yes to it, not by retreating in pain.
So for him, nihilism was both this huge existential threat and an extraordinary opportunity.
Absolutely. It was the crisis that demanded a powerful affirmative response. He saw himself as the first person strong enough to look into the abyss left by the death of God without flinching, without retreating. He stated, "I praise, I do not reproach nihilism's arrival. Whether man recovers from it, whether he becomes a master of this crisis, is a question of his strength."
The philosopher Martin Heidegger later famously interpreted this death of God as the inevitable end and downfall of 2 millennia of Western metaphysics itself.
A total turning point in human history.
So how does one face this crisis? For Nietzsche, the fundamental driving force in life steps into the vacuum left by God. And that is the will to power. Der Wille zur Macht.
The will to power is the basic element Nietzsche posited to explain all human and perhaps all cosmic behavior. It moves far beyond the simple utilitarian idea of survival or pleasure-seeking. It is a fundamental drive for mastery, for growth, for overcoming resistance, and for expansion.
So if the will to power is the primary driver, then it immediately rejects the common idea that we are all motivated by happiness or pleasure.
Completely rejects it. Nietzsche argued that happiness is not the aim of life, but rather a consequence of fulfilling the will of successfully overcoming hurdles and exerting one's strength. He even believed that the drive for simple self-conservation is only an exception to the rule.
What does he mean by that?
He means that more often self-conservation is a consequence of a creature's successful exertion of strength and power on the outside world. An organism doesn't just want to survive, it wants to dominate its environment, to grow, to expand its influence. Survival is just the byproduct of that successful striving.
Now, this is where the concept moves from psychology into deep, challenging metaphysics. You mentioned the controversy that surrounds the idea that the will to power might extend to the material world itself. Let's address that head-on.
This is a point of significant scholarly debate, and it's mostly found in his unpublished notebooks, the Nachlass, which were intended for a book he never finished. Nietzsche speculated that the entire material world, even seemingly inert, inorganic matter, may be fundamentally defined by the dynamics of the will to power.
What does that mean for the structure of reality? I mean, a rock doesn't have a will.
It means rejecting the 19th century scientific idea of atomism, the idea that matter consists of stable, indivisible units. Instead, he cited the work of the physicist Rudyard Bukovich, and he proposed that matter's qualities result from a dynamic interplay of forces. The world is not made of stable things, but of centers of perpetually striving power.
So even at the most basic level, reality is an endless, unstable interplay of forces seeking to overcome and expand.
That's the metaphysical speculation. The will to power, in this view, becomes a universal dynamic principle. It argues that even physics is fundamentally driven by a striving impulse, not by passive stability.
That's a massive philosophical statement. But since these ideas were mainly in his unpublished notes, why the scholarly dispute over whether he abandoned them?
Well, some earlier scholars argued he may have retreated from this grand metaphysical generalization late in his life. However, more recent analysis confirms that while he requested a small fraction of his notes be burned, the vast bulk of the will to power material remained. This indicates the core project. The metaphysical challenge to scientific materialism was very much active. It positioned his philosophy as a total reevaluation of reality, not just human psychology.
This ceaseless striving, this universal will to power, leads to the ultimate test of affirmation, the doctrine of eternal return.
The eternal return is a terrifying hypothetical concept. It's first proposed as a thought experiment, a parable in the gay science. He asks you to imagine a demon appearing to you in your loneliest solitude.
And the demon asks you a question.
The demon asks, would you be willing to live this life, every single detail, every pain, every joy, every tedious moment, again and again in the exact same sequence, infinitely? Nietzsche called this hypothetical question the heaviest weight imaginable, das schwerste Gewicht.
The question isn't whether the universe will recur, but how you would react to the mere possibility.
Precisely. It is a cosmological sieve, a test designed for the strongest individuals. Most people, he thought, trapped in nihilism or slave morality would be instantly crushed by the horror of infinite recurrence of their suffering and mediocrity.
So the test is whether you can not only come to peace with this idea, but actually embrace it with joy.
The profound, joyous embrace of it. This marks the ultimate affirmation of life, what Nietzsche termed amor fati, the love of fate.
And that stands in direct, stark opposition to Schopenhauer's philosophy, which saw life as something to be escaped. Amor fati demands you love everything that has happened because every failure, every mistake, and every moment of pain is integral to who you are right now.
It demands total, unconditional affirmation. If you were to reject any single moment of your past suffering, you would destroy the possibility of your current self. Therefore, the strong individual must will the recurrence of the whole, the good and the bad.
I find the philosopher Alexander Nehamis's reading of this idea incredibly clarifying because it sort of extracts the concept from cosmology entirely.
Nehamas suggested that the eternal return functions primarily as a moral imperative, independent of whether the physical universe actually recurs or not. It means that individuals constitute themselves through their chosen actions. To maintain your current self, your identity, you must be capable of willing the recurrence of every past action.
It turns life into an irreversible work of art, forcing you to ask, are you living in a way that you would want to live eternally?
Exactly. And the person who is strong enough to look that demon in the eye and say yes to that question, who overcomes the void left by the death of God and nihilism, is the Übermensch.
The Übermensch, often translated as the Overman, or more famously, Superman. This figure is introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra as the solution.
He is the solution. This figure is not an endpoint. He's not a biological mutation. He is the creator of new values, untainted by traditional slave morality or what Nietzsche called the spirit of gravity, the heaviness of tradition and guilt.
So he's not the goal, but a bridge to something new for humanity.
Absolutely. Zarathustra proclaims, "Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? Behold, I teach you the Übermensch." The Übermensch is defined by this constant self-overcoming, rising above the mediocrity and the ethical assumptions of the herd mentality.
And crucially, the Übermensch is contrasted with the last man. That's a bleak warning about where modern society is heading.
The last man is Nietzsche's terrifying vision of comfortable, democratic, egalitarian modernity. They are apathetic, passionless, mediocre creatures who merely pursue comfort, earn a living, and try to avoid offense or pain. They have their little poison for the day and a little poison for the night, and they blink.
They are the danger, the final stage of cultural decay, where humanity has dread itself into complacency and the creation of the Übermensch becomes impossible.
He is the ultimate dead end.
And we must reiterate one more time the tragic misinterpretation of this concept. The Nazis, through his sister's influence, literalized the Übermensch into a racial superiority concept.
It is the ultimate intellectual theft. Nietzsche's Übermensch is defined by intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic strength. It has nothing to do with race or national origin. He was explicit in his condemnation of the very anti-Semitism, nationalism, and pan-Germanism that the Nazis later claimed he espoused. The Übermensch demands a radical individual reevaluation, not blind adherence to a national herd.
It's impossible to discuss Nietzsche's greatest philosophical leaps, the will to power, the eternal return, the Übermensch, without acknowledging the tragedy of his final decade. His intellectual life ended so abruptly with his mental breakdown.
It did.
It seems almost cruelly ironic that this man, who championed strengths and overcoming resistance, was himself, in the end, broken physically and mentally. Does that weaken the impact of the Übermensch concept?
That's a profound question. You could argue that his personal collapse proves his philosophy was an overreach, a desperate attempt to impose meaning where none exists, a kind of noble failure.
But you don't see it that way.
I don't. I think the tragedy actually sharpens the stakes of his philosophy. It shows the incredible, almost unbearable pressure that the task of self-creation places on the individual in a meaning-deprived world. His philosophy wasn't a description of what is easy. It was a heroic demand for what is possible, even if that demanded strength ultimately surpassed his own physical and neurological limits.
The end came on January 3rd, 1889, in Turin, Italy. And we all know the famous, perhaps apocryphal, image of him running to a horse that was being flogged in the street, throwing his arms around its neck and then collapsing.
He was never intellectually himself again after that moment. The writings immediately following this collapse are known as the Von Brief, or the delusion notes, short, frenzied, bizarre pieces that he sent to his friends, signed with dramatically conflicting, often messianic identities.
What specifically was he writing in those notes? What did the delusion look like?
The delusions were expansive and deeply personal, and they referenced his own philosophical journey in a fractured way. He signed them variously as Dionysus, the ecstatic, life-affirming god from his first book, or as Der Gekreuzigte, the crucified one, the ultimate figure of slave morality.
So his own philosophical dualism had fractured into a pathological reality.
It seems so. He wrote political commands like ordering the German emperor to come to Rome to be shot. He claimed he had Caiaphas put in fetters and had abolished Wilhelm, Bismarck, and all anti-Semites. It was a complete break from reality.
The original medical diagnosis for this collapse was tertiary syphilis, but modern scholars have introduced significant challenges to that theory, haven't they?
Yes, the syphilitic diagnosis fit the medical paradigm of the time, but the symptoms don't perfectly align. Modern alternatives include really complex diagnoses like manic depressive illness with periodic psychosis followed by vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, or even a rare hereditary stroke disorder called CADASIL.
Regardless of the exact neurological cause, the result was the same.
The result was silence. He lived his final 11 years completely paralyzed, uncommunicative, and dependent on the care of his family. He died in August of 1900 after a bout of pneumonia and another stroke.
And it is in this tragic aftermath, when he cannot defend himself, that the most catastrophic distortion of his work occurs, thanks entirely to his sister, Elizabeth Friedrich Nietzsche.
Elizabeth is really the villain of this story. She returned to Germany from Paraguay after her aggressively anti-Semitic husband committed suicide in their failed Germanic colony, Nueva Germania.
A fascist utopia that failed.
Exactly. She immediately seized control of her ailing brother's intellectual property, his notebooks, his manuscripts. She saw it as a vehicle for her own ideology.
And this was intellectual forgery, plain and simple. How did she go about tailoring his philosophy to fit her own German ultranationalist and anti-Semitic agenda?
She edited and compiled his unfinished, unpublished notes into the now infamous volume, The Will to Power, which was published posthumously in 1901. She did this through selective omission, intentional misarrangement of his aphorisms, and sometimes, it's argued, outright modification.
So she would just remove things that contradicted her views.
She would remove aphorisms critical of Christianity or nationalism or German prejudice to create the completely false illusion that Nietzsche supported her views. She created a fascist Nietzsche out of a philosopher who explicitly hated everything fascism stood for.
It's an astonishing betrayal.
The irony is just profound. Not only did he break with his publisher over anti-Semitism and rupture his deepest intellectual relationship with Wagner, partly due to pan-Germanism, but he also wrote passages actively praising Jewish contributions to human history.
What did he say about them?
He credited the Jewish people for upholding respect for ancient Greek philosophy and for giving rise to the noblest human being, Christ, the purest philosopher, Baruch Spinoza, the mightiest book and the most effective moral code in the world.
So his association with Nazism and fascism was fundamentally a branding exercise orchestrated by a malicious editor, not a reflection of his own political thought.
Exactly. And luckily, the 20th century saw a major correction. This was led by diligent, meticulous scholars like Walter Kaufmann and Georges Bataille.
What did they do?
They produced corrected, critical editions of his work, they exposed his sister's manipulations, and they defended the authenticity of his thought against the Nazi appropriation. This tireless work allowed his true ideas to experience a renewal of popularity and philosophical rigor, beginning really in the 1960s.
And the legacy of those authentic ideas is truly pervasive. It touched countless intellectual movements, starting with his intellectual kin, the people he admired.
He felt an immediate kinship with two specific figures. He called Fyodor Dostoevsky the only psychologist from whom I have anything to learn, recognizing in Dostoevsky's novels a profound understanding of morality, guilt, and the complex, often dark nature of human motivation.
And the other great admiration was for an American.
Ralph Waldo Emerson. He said, "Never have I felt so much at home in a book as when he was reading Emerson's call for radical self-reliance and individual striving against conformity."
His influence on subsequent philosophical movements is just undeniable. He's often considered the starting pistol for several major schools of thought.
He is a key precursor to existentialism, postmodernism, and post-structuralism. Existentialists like Albert Camus drew heavily on his affirmation of life in the face of the absurd.
And the postmodernists.
Postmodernists like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida built their entire critiques of objective knowledge and grand meta-narratives directly upon Nietzsche's perspectivism and his historical method of genealogy. His influence truly defined the intellectual landscape of the latter half half of the 20th century.
And beyond pure philosophy, his concepts just flowed directly into art and literature.
Oh, absolutely. Thinkers like W.B. Yeats, August Strindberg, and D.H. Lawrence all absorbed his ideas about vitalism and the critique of modern repression. Thomas Mann, in particular, used Nietzsche's philosophy as the central, terrifying intellectual source for the composer Adrian Leverkühn in his great novel Dr. Faustus.
Even in music.
Even in music, composers like Richard Strauss and Gustav Mahler utilized themes and concepts directly from Thus Spoke Zarathustra in their major works.
Finally, there's that profound political irony again. The fact that his philosophy, designed to help the individual overcome the herd, was adopted by radical political figures all across the spectrum.
It just demonstrates the explosive power of ideas that demand a total reevaluation of everything. His emphasis on radical individualism and the will to overcome the herd resonated with profoundly diverse leaders. You had Zionist thinkers like Chaim Weizmann,
Russian Bolsheviks like Anatoly Lunacharsky,
and, regrettably, fascist figures like Benito Mussolini, all claiming him as an influence. His work provides the tools for radical self-definition, and once those tools are released into the world, anyone seeking revolutionary change can pick them up.
It's a testament to the raw force of his thought, that it could appeal both to those seeking individual liberation and to those seeking collective totalitarian power.
So, to summarize the massive scope of this deep dive, we have traced Nietzsche's path from a promising, pious student to a radical cultural critic whose health broke, but whose thought shattered the very foundations of Western objective certainty.
His work left us with the concept of perspectivism, rejecting objective truth, a shocking genealogy of morality, showing that modern ethics sprung from the poison of resentment, and of course the monumental challenge of the Übermensch, who must define new values in the profound vacuum left by the death of God.
And critically, we have reaffirmed the historical record. Nietzsche was fundamentally opposed to the German nationalism and the anti-Semitism that his sister so cynically weaponized his legacy for. His authentic call was always for the individual to rise above mediocrity and the temptation of easy answers.
That brings us right back to his critique of the last man, the comfortable, apathetic, consuming creature of mass culture. Nietzsche believed the press and mass opinion were leading us toward this cultural mediocrity, encouraging a debilitating herd instinct.
His philosophical injunction was for exceptional individuals to pursue what he called aesthetic health and to define new values beyond any morality for all.
So here is the provocative thought we want to leave you with, the challenge for your own personal ethical striving today. Nietzsche warned us that mass culture leads to conformity, and that exceptional individuals should pursue self-defined strength. In an age of algorithms, social media echo chambers, and constant consensus pressure, are you engaging in a mere performance of resistance, or are you truly building your own unique table of values, one powerful enough that you would will its eternal recurrence?
The strength required to be a true individual was never greater than it is right now. Thank you for diving deep with us.